In this session, we're going to talk about Islam. As you may remember, when we talked about Judaism, I talked about that it is the foundation of the three major monotheistic religions that we find today. You have ancient Judaism, and out of ancient Judaism, you have modern Judaism, Christianity, and also Islam. And so, like Christianity, there's a period of shared history, a period of shared leaders, of shared prophets that you have with Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. And even, although not as tightly and not as identically, and even some sharing of text, of scripture, and of historical events. Islam gives a little bit different interpretation or telling of some of those historical events than what you would find in the Judeo-Christian scriptures, but still very similar. As a matter of fact, they are similar enough that Muslims refer to Jews and Christians as people of the book, meaning that there's a book that there's a shared recognition of and respect for, and typically that's the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, as well as the New Testament of Christianity. But Islam sheds some different light on some of those stories recorded in those scriptures. So Islam is the most recent of the major world religions. It emerged into history as a distinct movement in the 6th and 7th centuries CE, so it's just been around about 1400 years, which in the history of mankind, that's not very long, even though it seems like a long time, but it's the most recent of the major world religions. But even though it's the most recent, it takes its roots back very deeply, as I said, into ancient Judaism, clear back really to the very beginning. And I want to read a couple sections from the Hebrew Bible, or from the Old Testament, that if you are familiar with the Old Testament, you may be familiar with these stories. But I don't know how often within Jewish and Christian circles these are read through the eyes of a Muslim. But there is a way that these stories are viewed that, again, you know, in my growing up years of being exposed to the Old Testament, I wasn't aware of, I guess, this lens or this way of looking at these stories. So I want to look at two stories from the book of Genesis. Again, you may remember that Jews, Christians, Muslims all trace their roots back to an ancient ancestor, Abraham. And so what you find here in Genesis, particularly I'm going to be reading from Genesis 16 and Genesis 21, are some stories that take this clear back to Abraham. And so when in Genesis 16, what's going on here is that God and Abraham have made this covenant that I talked about when I was talking about Judaism, that Abraham has responded to God, he's moved to this sacred land, this holy land, and what's supposed to happen is that Abraham is supposed to have many descendants who inhabit this land. But when you get to Genesis chapter 16, Abraham and his wife Sarah are about 100 years old, and they have had no children, which would seem to be problematic if you're supposed to have descendants to fill this land. And so what happens in Genesis chapter 16 is something that I think Abraham's wife Sarah often is criticized for, but in reality, in that culture, she did what a responsible wife would do. The understanding in this ancient culture is that if in a household there were not enough children being born from the wife of the household to meet the labor needs of the household, to be able to provide for the parents when the parents got older, to be able to take over the inheritance when the parents died, then it was the wife's responsibility to find other women to bear children for the household, to make sure that the needs of the family and the legacy of the family would be met. So what Sarah did here was actually what a responsible wife would do, even though I think she gets critiqued for this often. But Abraham's wife Sarah had not borne him any children. However, she had an Egyptian slave girl named Hagar. And so she said to Abraham, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Why don't you sleep with my slave girl? Perhaps she can have a child for me." Abraham agreed with what Sarah said. So she's done, again, what a responsible wife would do. They're supposed to have a lot of descendants to inhabit the land. Plus, Abraham, he's got a lot of wealth. And so they're going to need children, at least to take care of that, besides to fulfill this covenant. So Sarah gave Hagar to Abraham to be his concubine. This happened after Abraham had lived in Canaan, in this promised land, this sacred land, for 10 years. Abraham had intercourse with Hagar, and she became pregnant. When she found out she was pregnant, she became proud and despised Sarah. I don't know what that looked like. I think we could speculate that maybe Hagar was seeing herself as the mother of this great holy nation that God had promised to Abraham. But for some reason, she was looking down on Sarah. So Sarah said to Abraham, "It's your fault that Hagar despises me. I myself gave her to you, and ever since she found out that she was pregnant, she's despised me. May the Lord judge which of us is right, you or me." Abraham answered, "Very well. She's your slave and under your control. Do whatever you want with her." Then Sarah treated Hagar so cruelly that she, Hagar, ran away. The angel of the Lord met Hagar at a spring in the desert on the road to Shur and said, "Hagar, slave of Sarah, where have you come from and where are you going?" She, Hagar, answered, "I'm running away from my mistress, Sarah." He, the angel, said, okay, so this is the angel of God, the God of the Old Testament, the God of the Hebrew Bible, said, "Go back and be her slave." Then he said, "I will give you, Hagar, so many descendants that no one will be able to count them. You are going to have a son, and you will name him Ishmael, because the Lord has heard your cry of distress." Okay, so the angel of God basically has spoken the same promise to Hagar that was spoken to Abraham at the time of the initiation of the covenant. This angel has said to Hagar, "I will give you so many descendants, no one will be able to count them." So who are those descendants? Well, from a Muslim perspective, the reading of this text is that that's them, that Ishmael is their ancestor back to Abraham, that they are these many descendants promised to Hagar, very much in the same way that Abraham was promised many descendants. Well, then you get over to Genesis chapter 21. And what's happened by the time you get to Genesis 21 is Hagar's gone back, and she's a slave of Sarah, but she's had this son, and she's named him Ishmael, as the angel of the Lord told her to. So you've got Hagar with Ishmael. But then Sarah has ended up getting pregnant and also having a son. And so she has a son named Isaac. And so you've got Abraham and Sarah and Hagar and these two sons in this household. And that's where you come to in Genesis 21. One day, Ishmael, whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham, was playing with Sarah's son Isaac. So, I envision they're outside playing together. Sarah's, watches them playing. And then Sarah starts focusing on her son Isaac and thinking about when he gets older and what life will be like for him and all this wealth that Abraham has that will be his wealth. And then it hits her. Or will it? Because there's two sons here. And the other son's actually the older son. So who will get this inheritance? And so this is what happens. So Sarah saw them. And then she said to Abraham, "Send this slave girl and her son away. The son of this woman must not get any part of your wealth, which my son Isaac should inherit." So Sarah knew that it wasn't clear cut. That if both boys were in the household and both boys were raised within this household, when the time came for Abraham's inheritance to be distributed, it was not going to clearly be Isaac's, apparently, or she would have felt confident about that. And so her solution was get Ishmael out of the picture. So send him away. Well, this troubled Abraham very much because Ishmael was also his son. But God said to Abraham, okay, so according to the Old Testament, now this is God coming in and saying these words to Abraham. "Don't be worried about the boy and your slave Hagar. Do whatever Sarah tells you, because it's through Isaac that you will have the descendants I have promised. And the Jews say, that's us. God goes on to say, I will also give many children to the son of the slave girl so that they will become a nation, because he too is your son. So who's this nation that God will populate with descendants from Ishmael? Well, again, Muslims say that's them, that they are the descendants of Ishmael, of their ancient ancestor. And so Muslims take their roots very deeply back in to Judaism, much as modern Jews do and as Christians do. Modern Jews believe that that son Isaac is their ancient ancestor, and Christians affiliate themselves with that same lineage. Muslims see themselves as Ishmael, as Ishmael's descendants, with him as their ancient ancestor. And very much a common way of interpreting this, but both linking themselves back to Abraham and the covenant that God made with Abraham, and God basically telling both lines that he would give many descendants and make a nation out of both lines. So Muslims take their roots back that deeply. But, as I said earlier, even though this was 4,000 years ago, Islam did not come on the scene as a specific religion until really the 7th century. So, 2,500 years after this is when Islam emerges as a distinct religion. And it emerges through the teachings of a prophet named Muhammad. And again, Muhammad started this movement called Islam. Sometimes people get confused with this. Islam is the name of the religion, of the movement, and Islam means submission, particularly submission to God or submission to Allah, which is God in the Arabic language, which is the primary language, which is the language of Islam. And people who follow that religion are called Muslims. And essentially Muslim means one who is submitted to Allah, to God. And Muhammad started this movement. I want to tell you a little bit about the life of Muhammad, because the way that Islam took form was very much rooted in Muhammad and the things that he did and the things that he taught. Muhammad was born in the city of Mecca, which was in Arabia, what we call Saudi Arabia today. And when he was born, his parents died when he was very young. And so he ended up being raised by an uncle. And his uncle was a camel driver. I often try to equate that to kind of understand how that fit in the society of the time. I mean, that would be like a truck driver today. I mean, there were lots of imports and exports throughout the Middle East, and those were primarily carried by camel caravans. And so Muhammad's uncle was a driver of a camel or camel caravans. That's what he did. He was involved in this import-export business as a transporter. So his uncle trained him in the same trade, the same vocation. He was never formally educated. Muhammad wasn't. As far as we know, he never learned to read or write, but he was trained as a camel driver, which again would have been probably common with somewhat that economic level in that culture at that time, to not be formally educated, but rather simply to learn a vocation or a trade. So he was born and raised there, trained there as a camel driver in Mecca. Now I want to tell you a little bit about Mecca, because the character of Mecca also plays into how the history of Islam unfolded. I don't know if this is a totally fair assessment, but I think you could compare Mecca to maybe like the New York City or the Los Angeles, but maybe New York City of Arabia at that time. Because first of all, Mecca was a major center for commerce. Camel caravans went in and out of there all the time as things were transported throughout the Middle East. Mecca was a major stopping point, a major trading point. So there was a lot of commerce, a lot of money, a lot of wealth flowing in and out of Mecca. If there had been a stock market at the time, probably would have been one in Mecca. It was also a major social center. We had all these people going in and out of Mecca for these business transactions, but you also had a major religious center, a major spiritual center there in Mecca. And so because of that, you also had a lot of people coming in and out of Mecca. You had a lot of spiritual pilgrims. So it was a major social center. And wherever you have a major social center, especially with people that are kind of transient, you tend to have things like gambling, prostitution, a lot of alcohol, a pretty active social life going on in Mecca. So it's a major business center, it's a major social center, and as I alluded to, a major spiritual center. Throughout Mecca and the region around Mecca, there were many shrines, many statues to various deities, to various animals set up. And so spiritual pilgrims would come to Mecca to have these spiritual experiences at these various shrines. And so there was a whole business of spirituality, primarily, again, polytheism, animism type spirituality that you would find there. And so as a result of that, Mecca was a major city, spiritual center, commerce center, social center. And this is the environment that Muhammad was raised in. Muhammad eventually left his uncle and went to work on his own. And he worked for a wealthy widow, a wealthy businesswoman there in Mecca. Her name was Khadijah. And he was basically he managed her camel fleet, he was her camel driver, and he was known to have a hard work ethic. He was known to have a lot of integrity. He was the kind of worker that you would want. Well, what eventually happened is that Khadijah, this older, wealthy widow woman, and Muhammad married. And so now she's his wife. And so basically they're business partners. And they become pretty prominent throughout Mecca because with his hard work, his integrity, her wealth, her business history, they were pretty known in Mecca. Well, what began happening was that Muhammad kind of began feeling like there was something that was missing or something that he just didn't have the whole picture, even though they were very successful there in Mecca. And so he started, as he would have opportunity, going outside the city and just trying to find whatever this was that was missing, looking for this probably spiritual essence that he just hadn't connected with at this point in his life. And what Muhammad claims began to happen is that he began to have these revelations. He began to have these spiritual experiences where an angel named Gabriel would come and speak to him. Same Gabriel that you read about in the Old and New Testaments. And Gabriel came and spoke to him on behalf of a God, or Allah as in Arabic, that had specific messages he wanted to say to Muhammad, and that eventually he wanted Muhammad to say to the people of Mecca. So he was receiving these revelations, and for a time was keeping this to himself. But then the angel began to tell him, first of all, to write these things down, and secondly, to recite them to others, to tell others about that. The written text of these teachings is what's called the Quran. Quran means to recite, just as the angel had commanded Muhammad to do with these teachings. Now, if you're following the story here a little bit, you're thinking, okay, but he couldn't read or write. And Muhammad is not considered a great miracle worker within Islam, but one miracle that's often attributed to him is the production of the Quran, because he couldn't read or write, and yet somehow he was enabled to produce this text about the size of the New Testament. And so he wrote these things down, but also he first went to his wife Khadijah. And he said, okay, I want to tell you what's been going on. I want to tell you about these messages from this God, and also that the angel's telling me that God wants me to say these things to the people of Mecca. Khadijah's response was, first of all, that she believed everything that Muhammad told her. And so she is considered to be the first Muslim, the first convert to Islam, because she accepted this message. And many Muslims say this shows the credibility of the message of Islam. Because when you look at the other great prophets of the other great religions, their families were not the first on board. And their families were often skeptical about what was going on. But when it came to Muhammad, his family and closest friends were the first on board. They were the first converts. So Khadijah, one, believed what he said, and two, said, and you need, if God's telling you to say these things, you need to say these things. So he starts preaching some of these revelations to the people of Mecca. The foundational teaching that he was told to communicate to the people of Mecca was monotheism, that there's only one God, to the exclusion of all other gods. There's one God, Allah. Well, that didn't fly with the spiritual people of Mecca because, again, this is about polytheism, many deities, worship of animals, worship of ancient deities. It wasn't about a one exclusive path and one exclusive deity. So he's preaching this message of monotheism and the falsity of all this other worship that is going on in Mecca. So basically he's ticked off all the religious people. Then another one of the core things that he taught was charity. That what Allah had told him was that when you had wealth, you were supposed to distribute it and share it with others. You weren't supposed to hoard wealth. Well, Mecca had a lot of wealth in it. And a sign of status was how much of this you had hoarded for yourself. And so now all the business people and all the commerce people are ticked at Muhammad because he's out here on the streets preaching against the accumulation of their wealth and saying that they need to share that and distribute that. Another part of his teaching was an ethical component. And he began telling the people that Allah expects a certain ethic out of people. And as he talked about that ethic, a lot of that was, basically, your basic moral commands that you would equate with the Ten Commandments, but also things like no alcohol, no prostitution, no gambling. The other thing that he preached was that he limited the number of wives that a man could have. I mean, one sign of status in that culture was how many wives you had. I mean, if you had 10 wives, then people go, whoa, he must really be rich because he can support 10 wives. And Muhammad came along and said, 4's the limit, guys. Well, so he kind of, whoever he hadn't ticked off yet, he ticked him off with this ethical teaching. And so basically, Mecca, as with prophets throughout time, Mecca rejected the teaching of this prophet. And what happened was that people began plotting to kill him to shut him up. Well, Muhammad and Khadijah and the few converts that he had, which again were mostly close friends of his, they got wind of this plot. And so they fled Mecca and they moved north, still in Arabia, to the city of Medina. And that happened in 622 CE. Well, when they got to Medina, the people there were much more open to the things that Muhammad was preaching. And so people just began converting right and left in Medina. So Islam really took off when they made this move to Medina. Because of that, first of all, that move from Mecca to Medina is actually kind of made distinct and given a name because that move was seen to be essential for Muhammad to really for Islam to really take off. And so that move from Mecca to Medina is called the Hijra, or sometimes it's called the Hijra, same word, just depends on who translated it. And so that Hijra is this move from Mecca to Medina in 622 CE that enabled Islam to really take off and grow once they got to Medina. Also, because of that, the Arabic calendar is centered around the year 622. So on an Arabic calendar, this is not the current Roman calendar year, but it's that year minus 622 because their calendar centers on that, not on the life of Jesus as the Roman calendar does. So 622 is considered the founding year of Islam, the Hijra more or less the founding event of Islam. So Islam pretty much spread throughout northern Arabia then over the next 5 or 6 years. So that by 629, Muhammad decided, let's go back to Mecca. Let's try to bring about conversion in Mecca again. And so he went to Mecca with, my summary of this is that he went there with a twofold plan for conversion. Plan A was to try to bring about conversion by persuasion, by preaching, just as he had before. So he got there, tried Plan A. People 7 years later weren't any more open to what he had to say than they were in 622. And so they rejected his message. Plan A didn't work. So he went to Plan B. forced conversion by military takeover. And so the army was there, called in the army. There was a several-day battle. Muhammad's army won. And so they set up Islamic law in Mecca. So now Mecca was under Islamic law, was Muslim. They knocked down all these shrines and idols that were there throughout Mecca. And they set up Islamic law and monotheistic worship of Allah there in Mecca. There was a big black rock or stone there in Mecca. And through one of the revelations that Muhammad had received, he had been told by God that this rock was a place that Abraham had actually made sacrifices to God and worshiped God during his lifetime. But since that time, it had become sort of actually one of these central shrines to all the polytheistic worship that had gone on in that area. And so one of the things that Muhammad did was he basically cleansed that stone and he reinstituted it as a place of monotheistic worship, rooted in the worship of Abraham, of Allah. That stone today is in what's called the Kaaba in Mecca. And when Muslims go to Mecca to make spiritual pilgrimages there, that's one of the central shrines that they go to, or the central places that they go to, is this Kaaba that contains this stone. And they walk around it 7 times, saying certain scriptures and prayers as part of their spiritual pilgrimage that we'll talk about here in a little bit. So now Mecca was under Islamic rule. But Muhammad died 3 years later, 632. By the time Muhammad died in 632, all of Arabia was under Islamic rule, either by persuasion, and so people had chosen to convert, or as a result of military takeover. And that's endured. I mean, there are other religions today in Saudi Arabia, but it is an Islamic country. Islamic law and governmental law are very complementary of one another in Saudi Arabia. Religions besides Islam cannot be propagated in Saudi Arabia even today. So what Muhammad set up 1,400 years ago has endured over time and is still the strong dynamic in that country today. Well, Islam, like all the other religions that we've studied, came to places along the way where they had some differences about what they believed, and a lot of those differences were about authority. But they still, even in their differences about authority and human authority, again, that's been the main cause of division within Islam. But the basic teachings of Islam are pretty united within the Islamic world. And those basic teachings are called the 5 pillars of Islam, or the 5 pillars of Allah. And in our next session, we'll talk about those basic teachings, but also talk about the human authority issues that came up that caused the splits within the Islamic world.